Well, here in Germany, the Social Democrats have pulled off a narrow election win in the eastern state of Brandenburg. Polls had given the far-right Alternative for Germany party the edge, but in a record turnout, voters gave the most support to the ruling Social Democrats, the SPD, the party of German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. A victory more so for the Chancellor's party, less so for the Chancellor himself.
Finally, something to cheer about. For weeks, the Social Democrats had been trailing in this election. But a late swing seems to have secured the SPD state premier here another 5 years in power. And yet, it was the second-place finish of the far-right AfD that got prominence in his victory speech.
If an openly, in large parts and in its entirety right-wing extremist party can achieve around 30% of the vote in our state, that is a huge alarm signal for all of us, for all Democrats, and for all those who stand for freedom, openness, and tolerance.
This was the moment the Alternative for Germany learned they hadn't come first. Still, a second-place finish is reason enough to be happy for a party that, despite being designated partly right-wing extremist by security services, is growing in strength.
We are the party of the future. If you want political change and transition, then you will have to vote for the AfD. This is a partial victory, and we are celebrating this victory today. The next elections are coming, and we will be right at the front for sure.
It was a miserable night for the Christian Democrats. They'd hoped to capitalize anger towards the parties in power in Berlin, but they ended up losing support. But despite the tears, they could well end up back in coalition. The Greens didn't get enough votes to return to Parliament, which could present a coalition possibility for the new kid on the block. The Sarah Wagenknecht alliance, which mixes left-wing economic policies with a tough line on migration, managed a solid 13.5%, despite this being their first Brandenburg election. For now, though, the winner of the night is Brandenburg's SPD leader. His future almost certainly secured, and with it, the pressure on the national government relieved for now.
And this is what German Chancellor Scholz said today about that election outcome.
We will go into the Bundestag election together, and I will want to repeat with my party what has now been achieved in Brandenburg and what was achieved before the Bundestag election, namely to make sure the SPD is the strongest party in the race, and we will do everything we can to ensure that the right-wing populists have no chance in our country.
All right, let's go to New York now and join our chief political editor, Michaela Küfner. She is traveling with the German Chancellor. Michaela, on this side of the Atlantic, the word is that the Social Democrats, the SPD, they won in Brandenburg not because of Chancellor Olaf Scholz, but rather despite Chancellor Olaf Scholz. Has that very sobering assessment reached your side of the ocean?
It has, and that Olaf Scholz knows that full well. He may live in neighbouring Brandenburg, which surrounds Berlin. He may have his constituency there, but it was Dietmar Woidke. It was one politician, his name, and also the choice he gave the voters. Either me, if you want me, then make sure the Social Democrats come in first, because if he had come second with the Social Democrats behind the far-right AfD party, Dietmar Woidke would not have continued in his role as state premier. So really it was a very personal election, and therefore it's a very personal victory for a regional politician, which, if anything, is raising more question marks whether the leadership style of Olaf Scholz, which is seeing him with historically low approval ratings, his coalition with a 3% approval rating in the latest polls, which sounds unbelievable almost, whether his style is really the style the Social Democrats want to go into the next elections here in Germany in 2025.
Yeah, the Chancellor, he must be under tremendous pressure. His governing coalition, which consists of 3 parties, would not win an election today. What do Scholz and these 3 parties, what do they plan to do, do we know, to change that before national elections next year?
Depending on who you ask, Olaf Scholz's argument continues to be that the coalition of his Social Democrats, the Greens and the pro-business Free Democrats is better than it's getting credit for, that a lot of the measures he's taken will only really shine through next year. And his plan is, and we heard it in that soundbite, to basically pull off the trick he did last time, which saw him go from the low double digits to then win these elections and become chancellor. But the setup is very different. And there's a lot of geopolitical tension that could become an election issue when it comes to support for Ukraine. Olaf Scholz has been meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine's president, here as well. And the Olaf Scholz who's sitting down at the table may lead the country that is the second largest supporter of Ukraine. Olaf Scholz may have vowed to stick with Ukraine for as long as it takes, but he hasn't pledged to do whatever it takes, because he also knows that that still doesn't go down well with some parts of his own party, and also a more general mood that has been expressed in these regional elections in the East, which are more skeptical of assistance for Ukraine.
Our chief political editor, Michaela Küfner, traveling with the German Chancellor in New York tonight. Michaela, thank you. All right, I want to pull in now Kai Arzheimer. He's a professor of political science at the University of Mainz. He's an expert on populist radical right movements in Europe with a focus on the rise of the AfD here in Germany. Professor, it's good to have you with us. Let's start by talking about the winner of yesterday's election, the Social Democrats, the party of the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. Some people are saying that the Social Democrats won not because, but rather despite Olaf Scholz. Would you agree?
I would tend to agree. I mean, it's no coincidence that the party kept the chancellor out of the campaign, that he stayed away, not just from the state, but even from Germany. But I think that's only part of the story. What is crucial for the SPD's success in Brandenburg is first that this has been a stronghold of the party for a very long time. So the party has controlled the state since the 1990s. And secondly, clearly Woidke maxed out his incumbency advantage. He even made this huge gamble saying he would retreat from politics if the SPD didn't come first. And because he's hugely popular, he could convert that in votes for the SPD.
How do you see this outcome for the AfD? The leading candidate for the AfD said that it didn't matter that they didn't win the most votes. What mattered is that they won, or they had the most youth votes, and that the future belongs to the AfD. Do you see it that way?
He would say that, wouldn't he? So I think this whole story about who's coming first is relatively moot in the multi-party system. It was always clear that you would need a coalition to run the state, and the AfD is politically isolated. So whether they get 28%, 31%, 30% doesn't really matter. So they were disappointed, but still they had a very strong night. They won round about 1/3 of the vote, and as you say, they were strong amongst younger voters, and this is a new pattern. So in the past, the AfD has been the party of the middle-aged, and now they have no disadvantage amongst young voters. That is indeed a new development.
Yeah, they've been making gains in these regional elections. We cannot say the same about the Chancellor's party and the three parties that make up the current government. I mean, if elections were held today, national elections, the current government, they would lose. So we've got a year until national elections. How do you see the Chancellor's party and these three parties, the Greens, the FDP, the SPD, how do you see them saving themselves if they want to get reelected?
I'm not sure if they're getting reelected. I mean, the campaign for the Bundestag started today. That much is clear. And the SPD is not doing well nationally. So are the Liberal Democrats, the Greens. They will all try to make some gains, but not as a coalition. I think from now on, it's basically every party fighting for themselves. And so I expect more conflict, less cooperation, probably less output from the federal government. I think they will now start going into campaign mode, basically.
Okay, and we know a year is an eternity in politics. Professor Kai Arzheimer with the University of Mainz. Professor, we appreciate your time and your analysis tonight. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.